Welcome, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Steve Van Devender here, co-host for tonight's Ostomy Academy with my dear friend Amy Lee Reese. We'd like to welcome you to tonight's fourth and final Ostomy Academy for 2024. We are very excited. We have over 400 people signed up, so we're very, very thrilled with the turnout so far. What is the Ostomy Academy? Excuse me. Ostomy Academy is a free online educational seminar presented by the United Ostomy Association of America to bring trusted and comprehensive ostomy information to all members of the ostomy community. Top experts, medical professionals, and experienced ostomates will focus on new series of quality of life topics in each presentation. One of the ways that you can get to all of our previous Ostomy Academies is go to ostomy.org/ostomy-academy, because we do all of them have been recorded and are available to be viewed at any time. Who is the United Ostomy Association? We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization that supports, empowers, and advocates for people who have had or will have ostomy continent diversion surgery. Between 725,000 and 1 million are living with ostomies, and approximately 100,000 new life-saving surgeries are performed annually in the United States. Founded in 2005 by the infamous Ken Ockett, UOAA will be celebrating its 20th anniversary in 2025. We've accomplished a tremendous amount as a grassroots organization with a small but dedicated staff and passionate volunteer board of directors. From launching a new website, connecting ostomates and their caregivers to over 285 affiliated support groups, building a national recognized advocacy program to reaching more people than ever, we have achieved many of our mission goals. Check out our website at uoaa.org. A tremendous amount of information there. At this time, I'll turn it over to my dear friend Amy Lee Reese, who will introduce our tonight's speaker.
Hey, everyone. Thanks, Steve. Always fun doing these with you. So our program tonight is a special one. I am on the board of UOAA. I also have an ileostomy from inflammatory bowel disease. So all of these programs are very near and dear to our hearts. Steve and the Ostomy Academy team spend a lot of time planning these topics. We'd love to hear from you too. Tonight's topic is special, very needed in our community. The title is Mental Health for Ostomates, Adjusting to Life with an Ostomy, a How-To Guide. So like I said, it's an important and sensitive subject, and we want to establish a safe container tonight. So all of us that are here to learn about mental health will feel kind of held in the space. I want to first of all thank all the people who registered. Our Ostomy Academy team was blown away by your thoughtful and vulnerable questions that you shared with us. Our speaker tonight has actually incorporated a lot of those pre-submitted questions into his presentation, so that will be fabulous. If you're joining us live and you have questions or comments throughout the program, you can put those in the chat. We're going to be moderating the discussion as the night goes on. So please speak up if there's something that you feel like you need support with. We have resources for you, and we can offer those. Keep in mind when you ask your questions to keep them general and also to the topic for our program. I want to also welcome those of you that are joining us by recording. We're so happy that you came to join us. So the program introduction, Ostomy Academy tonight is going to be learning about adjusting to life with a new or existing ostomy. And then it can be difficult and cause strong emotional reactions. The idea of healthy adjustment or ideal life for you might look different, and it might not be neatly defined. So we're going to discuss the concept of healthy adjustment to ostomy surgery and how one might have a fulfilling life with an ostomy. Steve and I are really excited to bring out our speaker for the evening, Michael Esteban Gerald. We heard Michael speak a couple months ago, and it was very impactful, so we're excited for him to share tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and bring Michael out. Michael is a... Hey, Michael.
Hey,
welcome.
Amy. Thank you. Thank you to you and Steve for having me. I'm happy to be here.
We're so glad you're here. Michael earned his PhD in rehabilitation counselor education from the University of Iowa. He is currently a licensed clinical mental health counselor and a certified rehabilitation counselor. He joins us tonight not only as a mental health provider, but also as a person living with an ostomy. So again, welcome, and we'll let you take it away from here.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I think Ed's going to help me as far as sharing my slides. Perfect. Thank you, Ed. Thank you again to Steve and Amy for having me here tonight. Thank you to all of you in attendance. I have to say, tonight is pretty special to me. It's been a long road to get to where I am with respect to adjusting to my own ostomy. And I will just tell you all that I consider myself to still be adjusting to my ostomy. So please don't walk away from tonight thinking of me as somebody who has achieved adjustment. As we'll talk about tonight, adjustment to any chronic illness, disability, or diversion in terms of an ostomy is ongoing, and we'll describe what that means going forward. We can go to the next slide, Ed. For tonight, forgive me, I'll start with my professional introduction. As Amy already noted, I'm an assistant professor of rehabilitation counseling. I'll say here at Utah State University. I'm in my office on campus right now. I am a licensed clinical mental health counselor and a certified rehab counselor. In addition to being a professor, I am a director of a clinical service line here on campus. I supervise other practitioners. I provide direct clinical services for persons with chronic illness, disability, and neurodevelopmental disability. So tonight, when you hear me talking about adjustment, some of the themes that I'll talk about will cut across disability, will cut across diagnosis, will cut across chronic illness, diversion, etc. So it's a bit of a catch-all, but I'm going to make the focus or the emphasis adjusting to using an ostomy more specifically. If you're curious at all, and I'll go through this quickly, I've been a mental health practitioner since 2013. I've worked in corrections, I've worked in private practice. So actually I did 6 years working as a mental health professional in corrections. I've also done outpatient substance abuse treatment, and I was a crisis counselor for a couple of years where I was on call and I would respond to homeless encampments, emergency rooms, things like that. We can go, Ed, to my personal introduction. As Amy noted, I am a person with an ostomy. I've had a colostomy since I was 18 months old, and at the risk of aging myself, that means I've had my ostomy for over 36 years. For any of you who have had an ostomy since the 80s, that would be me. And it was interesting it is interesting, as technology has evolved with respect to ostomy supplies. Some ostomy supply companies will have cute little bear pouches for children. Back in the day, I was using adult pouches. And so my parents would comment, or have commented since, that at the time I was wearing a pouch that quite literally took up most of my torso and went down to the middle of my thigh. And it wasn't even one of those, nighttime pouches for a lot of output. It was a regular pouch, but it was an adult pouch for a kid. If you're curious as to why I have my ostomy, I actually don't have IBD. I don't have an injury, and I've not had cancer. I have a relatively unique combination of diagnoses and experiences. I developed a lymphangioma shortly after birth. For those who don't know, a lymphangioma is less of a mass with respect to tumors and more of an entanglement of lymph nodes that forms into a mass. That lymphangioma grew and it perforated my rectum. And as a result, I required ostomy surgery at 18 months old. My first ostomy, I've had two. My first one was a transverse ostomy in which I had two stomas, one for stool and one that was a mucus fistula. And we had to jury rig my setup because there wasn't a pouch for my mucus fistula. So we used a 3M bandage on one side and a one-piece Caraya sealed pouch on the other. And I'll just be honest, it was a disaster. From 18 months to 12 years, I had leaks pretty much every day. It was a pretty terrible experience with an ostomy. I would argue, though, not just because I had an ostomy, but because my equipment at the time and the nature of my stomas were really unworkable, and it was a really poor system. One of the things that the surgeon did is, in an effort to make my stoma less noticeable, they made the stoma very flush to the skin. All of you know that means that your output doesn't empty completely into the pouch, and that was part of why I was having leaks all the time. At age 12, I had my ostomy moved to my sigmoid colon. I now have one stoma on my sigmoid colon, and it's a nice protruding stoma, and I use a two-piece system in case you're curious with respect to pouching. I have also been a volunteer at the Youth Rally for over 15 years. For those who don't know, the Youth Rally is a week-long annual stay-away camp for youth aged 11 to 17 who have any sort of bowel or bladder diagnosis and subsequent diversion. Now, by the way, that diversion does not have to be a pouch. Some of our youth will do things like a bowel program, or they'll be med managed, or they'll do enemas, but some kind of bowel bladder diagnosis and some kind of subsequent diversion is all people need to be able to attend our camp. We see, sorry, I keep wanting to say clients because I was just in my clinic earlier. We see youth with any diagnosis ranging from Crohn's colitis to Hirschsprung's to short gut, to people like me who had some sort of tumor or mass. We've had familial polyposis. We've had youth with cancer diagnoses who have come to us after. So we've seen any number of diagnoses, but all have been related to some sort of bowel bladder impairment. As I noted earlier, adjusting to my ostomy has been a gradual and continual process, and I know that this will be a potentially controversial statement, so I'm just going to make it once. But I do personally identify as a person with a disability. I have friends who use ostomies who have other diagnoses like spina bifida, cloacal exstrophy, and they might use braces on their legs. They might use a wheelchair for assistance with mobility. And for me, I look at that and I see community. I see relationship. I see connection through experience, because even though I don't have a mobility impairment, I do share the same disabling condition in some way, shape, or form with them. Again, that's a personal belief, that's a personal feeling, that's a personal identification, but you are welcome to identify me or refer to me as a person with a disability. It doesn't bother me. And you're also welcome, by the way, if you have questions about me personally. Part of why I'm here is to be open and in a less professional manner. So you're welcome to ask questions in the chat. Ed, we can go to the next slide. So what we're going to talk about, and I want to be mindful of this in working with Amy and Steve and Ed to put the content together for the, oh, and Liz, forgive me, Liz, for leaving you out of that list. We wanted to make it so that what I talked about in my PowerPoint was going to take up less of the session. Again, I work as a therapist. I also work as a counselor educator, and specifically I teach in a program that is specifically geared towards providing counseling and psychotherapy for persons with chronic illness and disability. So I want to allot as much time as I can to answering those questions or those types of questions. This information I'm going to move through relatively quickly because I don't want to make the didactic or content material a significant portion of what we do tonight. I'll discuss adjustment to life changes. The framework that I use in my therapy is not one that is symptom reduction oriented or behavior change oriented. And instead, I like to focus on working with clients in a holistic manner such that I can help them integrate their new experience with chronic illness, disability, diversion into their existing identity framework. That way they can construct a life for themselves that fits within what they would have done had a diagnosis, surgery, medical condition, what have you, occurred. I'll discuss coping strategies common in adjusting to health conditions in ostomy surgery. You're going to see the term health conditions quite a bit. The reason that I left that in there and we're not only talking about ostomies is because, as we all know, 9 times out of 10, ostomy surgery is necessitated by some kind of health condition. Now, I do want to be mindful. There are people who have ostomy surgeries due to trauma, violence, like gunshot wounds, or an accident that might lead to some sort of paralysis of the bowel. But by and large, most of us who use an ostomy have some sort of underlying health condition that we will talk about going forward. We'll discuss causes of stress in health conditions and ostomy use. Why is it that having an ostomy induces potentially negative emotional experiences? I'll discuss potential emotional reactions to health conditions and ostomies. I'll describe what I generally observe as being the process of adjustment in persons with health conditions. Again, this is a model that we've come up with in the clinic where I work, and it's a model that transcends diagnosis. So we see it in clients who experience a stroke. We see it in clients who have reproductive health issues. We see it in clients who have IBD, etc. I'll then describe the components of adjustment to health conditions that are usually present. So meaning when people do begin adjusting, do begin to feel better about life with a diversion like an ostomy or a chronic illness or disability, what generally comprises their life and experience? I'll talk about those factors. And then lastly, we'll get to questions and answers. And what I did, and I want to be very careful with how we did this. Please know you are still welcome to submit questions via the chat. What I attempted to do was to go through the questions that were submitted beforehand, identify common themes, and then we're going to talk about those themes. So what I mean by that is there were several questions about how do I manage anxiety? How do I manage social anxiety? I'm going to talk about, in a question and answer slide, anxiety broadly in an effort to get to everyone's questions. Is there an adult rally? I think that's the UOAA conference, but I'll let Amy and Steve speak to that. Although I will say many of our counselors, by the way, all of our counselors are persons with some sort of IBD, some sort of bowel bladder dysfunction, some sort of diversion. All of our counselors have an existing diagnosis, and I would argue most of them will say that a big part of the reason they come back to Rally is to be able to experience the Rally. So Z, if you're interested, please feel free to apply to be a counselor for the Youth Rally. Ed, we can go ahead and move forward. So in this first section, I'm going to talk about adjusting to life with an ostomy. Think about adjustment broadly. So some of these constructs that I'm going to describe are constructs that I see occur across disability, chronic illness, diversion experience, but I'm going to provide specific examples of living with an ostomy. We can go to the next slide, Ed. A couple of things that I want to do first, as far as setting the stage for what we'll talk about in the ensuing slides, is there are three things I want everyone to keep in mind. Number one, there is no right or wrong. This is me editorializing, but please, I wouldn't, as a person with a disability, as a person who works with other people with chronic illness and disability, I do not believe there is a right or wrong way to adjust to disability. If you don't want to run a 5K, don't run a 5K. If you don't want to climb a mountain, don't climb a mountain. If you don't want to have kids, don't have kids. There is no right or wrong way to adjust to a disability. You don't have to become an inspirational speaker. You don't have to do anything in particular to adjust to a diversion. There is no right or wrong way to do it. If you want to swim every day, great. If you don't want to swim every day, you don't have to. There's nothing that says that you have to conquer every obstacle, you have to overcome every barrier. There's nothing that says there is a right or wrong way to adjust to a health condition, diversion, etc. Everyone's adjustment will be unique for them. There is an emphasis in this presentation and in my own work on acceptance. Now, we'll talk about this actually later, so I'm only going to go over this briefly. When I think about acceptance, what I generally think about is, can I accept myself as a whole person? Now, I know, mental health on social media talks a lot about holistic practice and holistic approaches. Often what I see in my field is when practitioners describe a holistic approach, it means that they're going to talk about multiple parts of a person. So yeah, I'll help you with your work stress. I'll help you with your physical health, or we might even talk about your diet or something to that effect. When I talk about acceptance with my clients, is can there be a part of me that maybe I don't like, or maybe I'm unhappy with, or maybe other people don't like, and can that be okay? So when we talk about an acceptance emphasis, I don't ever want people to walk away from therapy with me. I don't want students to walk away from my classes feeling like there's something about them that is wrong with them, particularly when we're talking about ostomies and it's something that I can't change. Have you thought about? Have you tried? We have to be very careful that we are not conveying to someone that they are unacceptable as they are, that they are unacceptable when it comes to something about themselves that they cannot change or make different. Lastly, and this is perhaps the most important component that I'll ask you to consider as we go through the different slides, and that is the concept of meaning making. As we experience life in general, whether we have a health condition or not, whether we use an ostomy or not, we engage in meaning making. We make meaning of our experiences, and that meaning making is a subjective evaluation of our experiences. Something happens, and I tell myself why that happened, why that's good, why that's bad, what it means to me. So as you're thinking about experience with an ostomy, I'm going to share some common experiences that people have, but I want to be mindful of the fact that our experience with a diversion or a health condition is largely due to the meaning making we engage in around our health condition or diversion. What does it mean that I have an ostomy? What does it mean that I have Crohn's? I had a client say to me the other day, a client who experiences chronic illness. They actually experience interstitial cystitis, or IC, which, by the way, would fall under our umbrella of bowel bladder dysfunction. And they said that my chronic illness means I'm too much for other people to handle and therefore not worth it. So what does it mean that I have an ostomy? When you're thinking about your anxious, depressive, etc. feelings around having an ostomy, consider, what does it mean to me that I have an ostomy? Does it mean I'm undesirable? I'm gross? I'm less than? I'm inferior? What does it mean to me that I have an ostomy? Ed, we can go to the next slide, please. There are two components broadly. I'm being pretty liberal here with my language, meaning I'm combining quite a bit just to get us down to the neat and tidy two. Whenever it comes to adjusting to any life change, whether it be a health condition, diversion, could even be life changes like career change, going from career to retirement, married to divorce, having children in the home to being an empty nester, any life change typically has two components. There's a practical behavioral, meaning what could I do? So relative to ostomy surgery, and Steve and Amy are going to share some resources going forward, yes, there are actually things I can do. I wear a pouch that has a filter so that I don't have to air my pouch out during the day. You might be wondering, well, what about odor? I use M9 deodorizing liquid in my pouch. Now, let's be honest, that doesn't work perfectly 100% of the time, but I'm just sharing with you what I use. I also, because I use a filter pouch, for those who use filter pouches, you know that they often are not flush to the skin. They often are a little bit aired up all the time. I wear a belly band. I wear a band around my belly that keeps it flat and flush to my stomach. It helps it so that it doesn't protrude. By the way, I'm going to stop here. These are all practical behavioral things I could do that help me swim, that help me go to the gym, that might even help with work or intimacy or what have you. By the way, don't worry, there's not going to be a lot of me talking about my own intimacy in this webinar, so you don't have to run away too quickly. But then there's also this emotional, social, and psychological component as well. And that is back to my previous slide, and I won't repeat it because I talked a lot about it. What meaning making am I engaging in around my medical condition, health condition, around my diversion, my ostomy, ileostomy, urostomy, colostomy, cecostomy, etc. What does it mean that I have that? Am I anxious? Am I depressed? Am I feeling ashamed? Am I angry? All of that is part of adjustment, because as you can imagine, my emotional and psychological responses are probably going to influence what I do practically and behaviorally. Two components. Ed, we'll go ahead and move forward. Thank you. These are coping strategies that are commonly observed in persons with health conditions. Now, I want to be clear. Remember, when we talk about coping, coping is neither good nor bad. Yes, technically, you could argue there's an adaptive and a maladaptive form of coping. For instance, you could argue, just bear with me here, that consuming alcohol helps me cope with anxious distress. It's a depressant, right? So it helps it helps me cope when I feel anxious distress. But, overuse of alcohol as a coping method is probably maladaptive. So when I talk about coping strategies, please don't look at these and think that they're good or bad. They are just ways in which people who experience health conditions or diversions make sense of their experience or try to continue functioning. Denial. Boy, did I live in denial for a really long time. You can either deny the reality of your situation. It's not real. It's not happening. For those of you who have experienced a new diagnosis, you might have experienced that early on. I don't really have that. I'll wait for the additional testing. I'll wait for the second and third opinion. I can also deny the permanence of my health condition. When I was a kid, this is ridiculous. I realize it now, but I remember thinking, my dad used to have this saying, like, we put a man on the moon. How could we not do X? It was his apex of technology. And I remember thinking that as a kid too, like, wow, we have all this technology, all of this science. I'm a kid who was around when the internet became a thing. I didn't grow up with it. I looked around and thought, how on earth could I have an ostomy for the rest of my life? There's no way. I never believed as a kid that my ostomy would be permanent. And I realize now, looking back, that it was a way for me to make sense of this thing that I really didn't like. And I'll talk about that a bit more going forward. Regression, this is where you become more dependent, more passive, more emotional. Essentially, think about it in terms of regressing to an earlier stage of development. We typically think of children as being more dependent. We typically think of teens as being more emotional, stereotypically, bear with me. And so maybe I'm an adult and suddenly I become more emotionally reactive as a result of adjusting to a health condition. So I could regress to an earlier stage of development. Compensation. This is one that I'm all too familiar with. I'll admit that readily. Individuals learn to counteract functional incapacitation in one area by becoming stronger or more proficient in another area. For me personally, there are two things that fall into this. Physical fitness. I always felt small. I always felt weak. I always felt less than. And so exercising, whether it be running track, whether it be lifting weights, was a way for me to be stronger, was a way for me to be faster, was a way for me to be not small. That was how I always felt. Additionally, I also compensate with respect to education and professional success. I recognize now that going all the way to PhD, going all the way to get my license, doing a little bit of everything, being a therapist and an educator and a clinical supervisor and a researcher, all of that is stacking up chips, so to speak, so that I can feel stronger, I can feel bigger, I don't feel as small, as insignificant, etc. I may also rationalize my behavior. So I run into this with persons with health conditions where they might say, I was going to do that, but it wouldn't work because of my diagnosis. I used to think I was going to do that, but then I was diagnosed with blank. I see this with Ostomates. I used to really love swimming, but now with the pouch, I can't even risk it. It's okay. I don't mind. Right? There's a rationalization piece there. And then lastly, diversion of feelings. This is where I divert negative emotional states or ideas into socially acceptable behaviors and perhaps even emotions. For the longest time, I took anger and I channeled it or converted it into drive, into passion. I really enjoyed, I lament this now, and I'm not proud of this, but I really enjoyed punishing myself through excessive exercise. That's why I liked running track. I could run a lot of miles. I could run miles and then go lift weights after. I don't love that idea anymore, but at the time it was a way for me to take pain, hurt. I look back now and realize how depressed and anxious I was as a kid. And I took all that and said, okay, I'm going to do this thing that is socially acceptable, competing in sports. Ed, we can go to the next slide. Now, the question that becomes, what causes stress when it comes to health conditions or diversions? Meaning, does an ostomy cause me anxiety? Now, we're going to talk a little later about trauma. Trauma is a little bit different. So we're going to just put that to the side for a second. But in general, what you have is you have the interaction between a health condition, an organism, a person's internal meaning-making experience, and their environment. The health condition, my internal meaning-making, and my environment. Now, in that system, in that milieu, so to speak, I could potentially begin to perceive threats. Now, I recognize that this seems like a dramatic word. I am fully cognizant of that, but I'm trying to capture and convey why people might experience the potentially negative or maladaptive emotional, psychological, and behavioral experiences that they have in adjusting to health conditions. Health conditions and ostomies can threaten my life and my health. For any of you who have been diagnosed with cancer, with Crohn's colitis, that's a direct threat to my overall health and well-being until surgery, until med management. But even then, we can have relapse, we can go into remission, but then we can have flares, etc. Health conditions can lead us to experience threats to body integrity and comfort, dealing with physical pain, dealing with, I don't know if any of you have ever felt uncomfortable just having an ostomy, the way I sit, the way I lay, the way I can feel it, etc. You might even experience a degree of mind-body separation, almost like there's an alien or foreign part of my body, and that is the ostomy. It's doing its own thing. It's not part of me, etc. I can experience threats to independence, privacy, and autonomy. Now, I'm going to talk about this later, but one thing that comes up for Ostomates pretty consistently is indignity, a loss of dignity, and threats to privacy. Again, because ostomies deal with bowel bladder functioning, things that aren't typically talked about in society unless they are talked about in looser, more relaxed, more comfortable, but usually more crass settings. Now, all of a sudden, I have a chronic illness or disability that requires, if I disclose it, I have to talk about bowel movements. And that's not typically something that we talk about in our normal social discourse. I often will tell students, I will tell clients, I'll tell volunteers at the youth rally that when you watch TV, if you watch even just like ABC or CBS comedies at night, Big Bang Theory, etc., they are more likely to depict, or at the very least hint at, sex and sexuality, which, by the way, for those of you who grew up with black and white movies, they used to depict people sleeping in separate beds. Now you can depict people who appear naked, sleeping next to each other. That's okay. You would never get away with depicting somebody having a bowel movement on TV. It's pretty rare. And when it happens, it's usually silly or comical or dirty in nature. All of those things can become associated with using an ostomy. Just a quick example. I was in a rehabilitation counseling class when I was in my master's degree long time ago. And I remember the professor of the class described ostomies and said, and I quote, "Can you imagine?" And they said it in this tone. "Could you imagine walking around all day carrying your bowel movement with you?" Now, for those of us who use an ostomy, it's a little bit different than that. It's a little bit more nuanced. I empty mine pretty regularly throughout the day. So more often than not, I'm not carrying a bowel movement with me. But again, it's taking this thing that we generally feel shameful about in our culture, and it's making it part of my outward appearance and experience. Threats to self-concept. Think of this in terms of, I have a health condition, I have an ostomy. Now, what does that say about who I am as a person? Threats to life goals. Can I still do, can I still be all of the things I wanted to do and be in my life? Maybe I had a goal of getting married, and now I worry that I won't be able to find a partner because I worry, forgive me, that people might find me undesirable or unattractive as a result. Threats to relationships that I have. Are people okay being around me, or might they experience a degree of disgust? Am I pulling away from people because I am worried about what people might think? Threats to economic well-being. This one's pretty self-explanatory. Ostomy supplies, health insurance can be expensive. Surgeries can be expensive. You guys all probably know that the largest amount of debt that Americans tend to carry is medical-related debt. Ostomies and the health conditions that lead to ostomies are no exception to that. And then lastly, threats to home and place. Now, this depends on the nature of your health condition, but for instance, if part of my ostomy use is also having a mobility impairment, that's going to shape where I live. Where I live will need to be accessible if I'm using leg braces, crutches, a wheelchair, etc. It could also mean that I want to live in a place close to a medical specialist. Clients of mine that I work with who have IBD might be, because I live in northern Utah, which is a little bit more rural, they might be 2 to 3 hours away from their specialist. One of my clients would drive 2.5 hours every month to go get their infusion for treating Crohn's. So in thinking about adjustment to health conditions, part of what health conditions and diversions can threaten is where I live, where I'm able to be. Ed, we can go to the next slide. Perfect. So these are only some of the potential negative reactions to health conditions. Now I want to be very careful here. I highlighted in this PowerPoint in particular, because of the nature of the questions that we received, I'm highlighting the potential negative reactions to health conditions, ostomy surgery. I want to be careful. There is, forgive me, the potential for positive, such that you can call it that, adaptive emotional responses to health conditions. For instance, I'll just share this personally. For me, I recognize that having had a disability for as long as I've had, I like to joke with people that I've gone through every developmental stage of my life, with the exception of potty training. I never learned how to do that. But walking, my first day of school, my first relationship with an intimate partner, starting a career, everything I've done it with an ostomy, with a disability. And what I tell people and what I share with my students is my personal belief, for me personally, as Michael, is I would not be able to be as sensitive, as compassionate, as empathic, such that I am. I'm not perfect in that regard. I wouldn't be able to be any of those things had I not experienced hardship, had I not experienced suffering. I know what it's like to feel awful. I know what it's like to experience self-loathing. I know what it's like to experience a feeling that others won't like or accept me. This is a particularly sad disclosure. But as a kid, so I'm talking like before the age of 12, somehow psychologically, I had this sense, without being able to articulate it, that there was a real concern somebody wouldn't want me, that people wouldn't want me. I never said that. I could never articulate that, but I was always intrinsically worried that I would never be able to get married. I would never have a relationship. And I fantasized very early on about being married. And I want to be careful. I fantasized about almost like a sitcom marriage, meaning I didn't fantasize about sex and sexuality. I fantasized about literally like coming home, putting my briefcase on the counter, honey, I'm home kind of thing. And in my mind, it was like, because then there would always be one person that you could go home to. There would always be one person who accepted you no matter what. And I know what that feeling is like. And as a result, I have a sense of purpose. My purpose, in my view, is to serve others. That's it. That's simple. I have many values, but my primary value is to serve others. So again, I'm highlighting here the potentially negative emotional reactions to health conditions, but I also want to be mindful that not all reactions to health conditions and ostomies are explicitly negative. Grief and loss, this could be loss of functioning, loss of bodily autonomy, bodily integrity. This can be grief with respect to, I often will describe to people that folks tend to grieve past, present, and future when it comes to health conditions. I grieve who I was, I grieve who I am, and I grieve who I thought I would be. I might experience fear, anxiety. A lot of the questions reflected something that I experience quite a bit, and that is social anxiety. What will happen if my ostomy, if I pass gas in a public setting, if I have a leak, if it falls off when swimming? What will a partner think if I undress and they see my ostomy before sex? Something like that. Anger, why me? I generally think of anger in terms of health conditions and ostomy surgery in terms of why. Why me? Why this? It's not fair, something to that effect. Depression is self-explanatory. And guilt, there's another word there, and I don't know if anybody's taking notes, but I would write this: guilt and shame. The reason those two go together is I might feel guilty for burdening others. I might feel guilty because of this sense that I need more, or I might inconvenience people with my presence. But that could also lead to shame, where I feel like I am bad intrinsically. Not just I did a bad thing, but I am bad. And shame, sadly, is a pretty common experience for persons who use ostomies. Ed, we can go to the next slide. Please remember, you can always throw comments and questions in the chat. I can't see the chat right now, but I'm moving through these slides relatively quickly so that we have at least some time for me to go over some of the items from the questions. What I generally observe from people that I work with in a clinical setting, and I said we, by the way, just because my clinic actually came up with this collectively. All of my clinicians work with persons with chronic illness, disability, and neurodevelopmental disability, like, by the way, autism, ADHD, etc. Generally, people move back and forth between these stages, particularly folks who have chronic illness, which might go into remission and flare, etc. Generally, when we are sick, when we are under the knife, when we are experiencing a flare, we are in survival mode. Meaning, what I tell my clients is, in this stage, all I need to do is survive. I just need to stay alive. That might mean laying in the hospital bed. That might mean going through surgery. It just means, or going through a course of treatment, something like that. There is nothing I need to do but just stay alive in this stage. Okay. Now, a step that people often skip is recovery. And recovery is not only physical, it's also psychological. But one thing that I see in persons with chronic illness, disability, and ostomy surgery is right after they've gone through this survival stage, they try and do everything that they were doing right before. And they might burn themselves out. They might even lead themselves into another flare, or make it so that they never fully recovered. I don't know how many of you have experienced a flare. I get infections with respect to my tumor. There have been times where I'll stop the antibiotic because I feel better, and then I'll start running again. I'll start going to the gym again, something to that effect. And then I just prolong the infection. Then I get to living. So now I've stabilized my health. I've recovered, gotten rest, gotten my strength back. Now I'm getting back into things. I know I didn't go hiking for a couple of weeks because I was recovering. Now I'm going to go for a short hike. I'm back to living. And then eventually where we want to get to is thriving. And that's where we get to this next slide. And this will be my final informational slide. Ed, we can go ahead and switch. So what does living and thriving look like? I already described what finding meaning and purpose in health conditions means. Meaning, by the way, is just a fancy way of saying why. So why am I here? Why do I have this? And then purpose is, and then why do I do what I do? So I believe that for me personally, how I've made meaning of my disability experience is it has positioned me to better help and support others, and therefore my purpose is to help, support, and serve others. People who tend to live and thrive with health conditions reevaluate goals and identities. Quite often, one of the things that happens is people will identify themselves based on their physical abilities as being core to who they are as a person. I am a runner. I am a swimmer, something to that effect. And then when I experience some sort of health condition or diversion, I might be left with, well, now who am I? Now what can I do? All those things I said I was going to do are suddenly in question. So we don't change them. I don't ever tell people give up. What I tell people is it's not a matter of if you will still do that thing. It's a matter of how. Clients I work with who are experiencing infertility, we don't say, well, you'll never have kids, so good luck. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of how. If you would like to swim, it's not a matter of if you'll do it again, it's a matter of how will you do that. It does require that we discover personal strengths. We find positive aspects of our health condition. Again, you want to be very careful here that you don't engage in something. And by the way, this is a real term. I'm not making this up. You don't want to engage in something known as inspiration porn, meaning you don't want to patronize yourself and say like, oh, because of my disability, blah, blah, blah. Because of my health condition, blah, blah, blah. You don't have to be cheesy or disingenuous about it. But quite literally, as I was describing earlier, maybe there is something positive about having a health condition. Maybe it has made me more sensitive and understanding. Maybe it has made it so that I'm more resilient going forward because I've experienced hardship, which, by the way, one of the requirements for developing resilience, experiencing hardship. Taking pride in mastery of health conditions. So what this means is it does help that we experience some degree of pride, some degree of reinforcement for mastering our health condition. Let's say, so actually this is a true story. My wife and I had a dream of backpacking in Gates of the Arctic National Park, which for those who don't know, it's the northernmost national park in the US. I almost said contiguous US, but it's technically not. It's in Alaska. It's in the Arctic Circle, and we wanted to backpack it. But you have to fly out to it. You have to take like a water plane, a float plane to drop you there. You're on your own. There's no services. There's no maintained trails. And so I had to think about it in terms of how am I going to do that with ostomy supplies? So in terms of mastery of the health condition, I was able to make it work where I did 2 weeks, 14 days of backpacking in Gates of the Arctic National Park with ostomy supplies that I had to pack and carry with me. I only had what I had with me. By the way, if you're wondering, yes, the end of that trip did go poorly. We ran out of food and were stranded for 3 days. So I did not run out of ostomy supplies ever. I did, however, run out of food. Seeking out new experiences. One of the things that happens with persons who experience a health condition and ostomy surgery is they stop trying new things. By the way, it could be eating new foods. I am notorious for being a picky eater. I will admit that right now, but that's because the things I eat agree with me and make it easy for me to live with my ostomy. If that means avoiding certain foods makes that easier, that's a choice I'm willing to make. That's okay. But what I often will see is people will describe not trying new things even though they want to. They will feel like I can't, or it'll go poorly, or something to that effect. And then lastly, people who are often living and subsequently thriving when it comes to living with a health condition or ostomy, they often engage in assisting or helping other persons with disabilities. Now, if you're curious as to what this model might be or where this might come from, just think about AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, or Narcotics Anonymous. Those models are peer-based models. And part of your graduation through recovery is coming back and helping others who are in the process of recovery. At the youth rally, all of our volunteers are persons with chronic illness, disability, or bowel bladder diversion. They are giving back to their community. Some of our campers even will help other I'm not making this up just as a tearjerker. I literally have seen campers who use leg braces pushing campers who use wheelchairs to help them get from point A to point B. Helping others is part of our adjustment. Not a requirement, but it is part of it. So let's get to the question and answer part. And I recognize this is a bit contrived. Ed, we can go to the next slide. Actually, the next one, forgive me. I recognize this is a bit contrived in that I'm not responding to specific camp just came up in the chat. I'm not responding to individual questions. Instead, I did a thematic analysis, so to speak, and pulled together some themes that I wanted to talk about quickly. A couple of things that came up. This idea of acceptance, but more of a negative view of acceptance, meaning acceptance versus settling, identifying and adjusting to limits. Now, I do want to be careful. Yes, there is the potential that living with a chronic illness, disability, or ostomy could present some limits, right? There is a degree to which we probably can't do every single thing. Okay. The question is, are the limits acceptable to me? So as I noted earlier, I'm a picky eater, just as a brief, light example. Technically, yes. In some way, shape, or form, I'm limited-ish in that there are things that don't agree with me and make it very difficult for me to live with an ostomy and live around other people with an ostomy, in my view. But am I willing to accept that limit with respect to food and eating? Because it opens up other things for me to do. And for me personally, that is okay. For others, they are not willing to accept limitations around eating. I know people at the youth rally, friends of mine with chronic illness, disability, friends of mine who use ostomies who don't put any limits on eating. Who cares if I get a leak? Who cares if my pouch balloons up? It doesn't matter to me. So when you're thinking about acceptance versus settling, the question is, this idea of settling isn't necessarily a bad thing, but is where I'm settling acceptable to me? Am I trying to make it acceptable? But in reality, it's distressing. That's the key. Are my limits, such as they are, acceptable to me? And I will tell you, this does take critical thought. I explore this a lot with clients who will say, I thought I was going to do that, but it's okay. And then we get into a conversation of, is it really okay? So things that you might have given up, things that you might restrict yourself from doing, ask yourself, is this really okay? Now, discouragement versus resilience. I got to tell you, I have some pretty strong feelings about resilience. Resilience is quite literally persisting, keeping going. That's it. It doesn't actually mean anything good. Meaning resilience, if you've ever felt that feeling of like white knuckling or gritting your teeth, if you've ever heard that phrase, grit and bear it, that is resilience. There are times where quite literally the only thing I can do is persist, put one foot in front of the other. It doesn't necessarily equate, though, to thriving or happiness or life satisfaction. So the question is, how do I avoid discouragement, despondency, apathy, resignation, and remain persistent and remain resilient? I would argue that the key is not internal. It's not grit or toughness or defiance. Those things are helpful-ish. But those things can also become corrosive. Those things can also make it so that I don't set appropriate limits and I push myself too hard. Instead, when I find people being the most resilient, but more importantly, experiencing something that we describe as post-traumatic growth, where I grow as a result of some degree of hardship, is when they have experienced hardship while connected to another person. So for those of you who are experiencing discouragement, despondency, etc., think about connection as a means to persist and keep going. Fear, anxiety, and life in public. Look, there is no answer to this one. I'm running out of time. I recognize that, and I'm trying to be conscious of that. There's no answer to this, and there's no timetable. I'm reticent to say, do this, and you won't be anxious, because that just isn't realistic. I'm 38. I work as a therapist, which means I sit quietly in a room with people for an hour at a time. That's scary still to this day. This is a terrible example, and I really hate sharing this. But I had a client where my ostomy made a noise. I passed gas in session. It was audible. The client heard it, and the client laughed at me. And here's where it got worse. The client never rescheduled. So quite literally, I don't mean to share that to say your worst nightmares will come true, but just to say this notion that don't worry, just use this technique and you'll never be anxious. It just isn't really realistic. Here's what I will say though. Anxiety tends to have a lot to do with predictions, more specifically, predictions that things will go wrong or be terrible, etc. So for instance, I might predict that I will have a leak. And as a result of having a leak, people will laugh at me, or they won't want to be around me, or they'll be disgusted by me, or something to that effect. And that creates anxious distress, which, as you all probably know, creates a bodily response. What we have to ask ourselves is, number one, will that terrible thing happen? Doesn't always. And then number two, if it does happen, will it be as bad as I think? So for instance, I had another experience where I passed gas in a session. It was audible, and a client just brushed it off, and I've met with them many times since, probably because they're a mature adult, unlike the other person I was describing. So it wasn't as bad as I thought, even though I was still very anxious when it happened. And then lastly, so again, will it happen? Maybe. Will it be as bad as I think? Could be. Lastly, and will I be able to handle it or recover? That's the thing that I often see with anxiety. We often overestimate the feared stimulus. This will be so bad. My wife will leave me if I have a leak. And I underestimate my ability to cope. And then my life would be over. Overestimate, underestimate. Will it happen? How bad will it be? Will I be able to handle it? Now, trauma is a slightly different animal. And I don't mean to say animal to make light of it, but just to say that trauma does have an impact on our adjustment insofar as it can actually change our neurobiology. It can actually have physiological effects. I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but for me personally, I've experienced enough medical trauma that there are certain smells that will get me to react. Now, I won't decompensate, but I will definitely experience some degree of distraction. When it comes to trauma, this will seem reductive. It'll seem overly simplistic, but I will tell you it's actually based on a model known as relational cultural theory that describes trauma as a disconnecting experience. So this could be, by the way, disconnection from others. It could be a disconnection from my physical self, like a mind-body separation. My body is untrustworthy now. It does things that I can't anticipate or control or rely on anymore. For those of us who have an ostomy, it's an incontinent diversion, unless you have like a cecostomy or something to that effect, or an appendicostomy. For most of us, it's an incontinent diversion. I can't always control when I go. I can't control when I have gas or what have you. I can sometimes control based on what I eat, for instance, but by and large, I can't control it. And that can lead to disconnection. So in order to heal, when it comes to trauma, we need connection. We need connection with others. We need mind-body connection, etc. Now, depression and life satisfaction, the big key here, when I think about depression, particularly when I think about depression related to adjustment to ostomy surgery, one of the hallmark symptoms of depression that we often don't talk about, we talk about sadness, hopelessness. We might even talk about suicide or suicidal ideation. We don't often talk about depression as being no longer engaging in those preferred activities. And this is something that is very common for people who experience health conditions and ostomy surgery. I have a client right now who has reproductive health issues. As a result, she experiences pain in her abdomen. And as a result, it limits how much, I live in a mountainous area, so you're hearing a lot of outdoorsy examples. She can't mountain climb or spelunk as much. And that has been really difficult for her. Again, the depression is not brought on automatically. It's the fact that it limits me being able to do the things I enjoy. So for those of you who might be experiencing depression, I would just ask, are you living the life that you want to be living? Living with an ostomy and desirability and talking about an ostomy with others, I have to confess, I want to be careful I share this so that I don't start to get emotional. Reading these questions was really difficult for me as a person, as someone who's lived with an ostomy for many years, as someone who has disclosed their ostomy to intimate partners and had it go poorly, as someone who's disclosed their ostomy to intimate partners and had it go fine, just perfectly fine. I've always personally, I'll just share this here with all these folks that I can't see, I have always worried about being and you'll have to pardon my language, I'm just trying to be as honest as possible. I've always worried about being gross or disgusting or undesirable or unattractive, etc. So reading these questions was particularly evocative for me because it brought about a lot of my own painful experiences. At one point, I was a nerd. I wore corduroy pants and tucked in polos, and I didn't listen to cool music, and I was small. I was a nerd in 7th and 8th grade. And a couple of people found out about my ostomy through the grapevine, so to speak. And I became the talk of the school. I became infamous, so to speak, not popular, infamous. And it got to the point that it was so bad, the mockery, et cetera, that my parents actually talked about switching me to another school. So this idea about desirability and disclosing to others, I do want to just, I don't share all that to say things will be a nightmare. I just want to share that to say, I took these questions very seriously, and I don't ever approach these with, oh, just do this one thing and everything will work out perfectly. So here's what I'll say. Remember what I talked about a moment ago with respect to anxiety, predictions. With respect to desirability, we are often predicting that because of our ostomy, we will be undesirable to others. Now, I'm assuming, by the way, we're talking about sex, sexuality, and intimacy with others. Again, what I would just say is that true? Will it be as bad as I think? And will I be able to bear it? My experience, and when I say my experience, I don't mean personal, just personal, forgive me. I mean my experience living and working with Ostomates is such that people find partners. People find intimacy. People find connection. So even if I have a bad experience with respect to disclosing an ostomy, with respect to intimacy and an ostomy, I want to be careful and say that probably won't be every single time. So as you're considering your level of desirability, just be mindful that I'm undesirable to everyone. I get it. And I know, because gosh, I've been there. I've absolutely been there. I know what that is like. I would challenge that and say, okay, maybe not to everyone. Fine. Even I have conceded that, right? Maybe not everyone is cool with being with an ostomate. Sure. But is it every single person? Is it every single one? And when it comes to talking about an ostomy with others, I'm actually going to steal from the campers I work with, who, by the way, have way more bravery and courage than I've ever had. Growing up with a disability, I did not share that I had an ostomy with anyone at all. I hid it as best as you can hide an ostomy, you guys know. So I was a very much a coward. I was very much okay with people, mocking other people with disabilities, because I was like, hey, at least it's not me. I was absolutely a coward. I work with these youth now, everyone, and I will tell you, they are so confident. They are so brave compared to how I ever was, and frankly, as I am as a grown adult. So when it comes to talking about an ostomy with others, one of the things I have found in my own experience and in working with youth with bowel bladder dysfunction, youth who use ostomies, the manner in which I talk about it dictates and determines how people receive it. The more confidently I talk about it, talking about it as a thing that is, not as the thing you're going to hate, as the thing you're going to be grossed out by, but talking about it as the thing that is, often makes it so that it's much more acceptable. On a much lighter note, I'll just share a funny story. When my wife and I first got together, if you didn't have your parents sign the permission slip with regards to sex and intimacy, please log off now or plug your ears. But when my wife and I first got together, we were hanging out at her place, and we were making out. Things were getting hot and heavy, and she started to pull my shirt off. I know, so aggressive. And I remember I actually grabbed her hands and I said, wait, I use an ostomy. And that was all that I could muster. That was all that came out. And I don't know if it was because it was the heat of the moment or things were hot and heavy or what have you, but she said, okay. And then we just kept going. So again, the manner in which you talk about it often determines how people accept it. But I will say this, going back to this idea of acceptance, we also have to be okay with people having, I almost cussed, poor reactions to it. We have to be okay with people being ignorant. We have to be okay with people being immature. We have to be okay with people being rude and disrespectful. And when I say okay, I don't mean that's acceptable behavior. I just mean we have to be okay knowing that, and that doesn't mean that I'm unacceptable. That client laughing at me, those peers of mine in school mocking me, that's them. I don't have to be a mockery. I don't have to have something wrong with me. That doesn't have to be true. It could just be a thing that happened. And then lastly, and in a related manner, ostomy-related stigma. So stigma, depending on the model that you utilize, stigma is described as essentially people are marked, and that mark is related to prejudicial attitudes. So for instance, if you think about stigma regarding mobility impairments or persons with disabilities, if you demonstrate a mobility impairment through the use of a wheelchair, crutches, what have you, you are marked. And then all of the prejudicial attitudes or preconceived notions that people have about disability are now put onto you. Now, with respect to an ostomy, my experience is people don't generally know a lot about ostomies. Careful. But because they involve bowel bladder movements or bowel bladder functioning, that's the stigma we often bear. So in dealing with ostomy-related stigma, a lot of what I do is I try to speak very matter-of-factly about my ostomy. I try not to engage in any of the overly hyper-positive rhetoric. I instead try to talk about it as a very real thing, but also a thing that's more or less a non-factor at this point. It is a part of me. It does inform a lot of my identity. I mean, I've gone through every life experience with an ostomy, but again, remember, part of combating those prejudicial attitudes is not living by them, is not accepting them as being who and how we actually are. Just because other people might think I'm gross or less than or what have you, doesn't mean that I am. Okay, I'm done on common themes and concerns. I think what we should do, there is a conclusion slide, but for our hosts, and I recognize I'm 10 minutes over, I'm happy to stay on and answer questions. I also want to be respectful of the time.
Hey, Michael. Oh my gosh, that was wonderful. No, I think that we should keep going. We've got a bunch of questions we want to get to, and I'd love to give some feedback. Your presentation was wonderful. It just, right out the gate with you being so candid and sharing personal stories, it was a great experience for me. You said that there's no right or wrong way to adjust to a disability. And it was just relief, it was automatically just the pressure was taken off. And Julia Frakes commented, "Wow, thank you." That was in the moment that you were talking about that. So yeah, lots of good things. I was taking notes. Steve, did you have any reactions or feedback for Michael?
Michael, I thought you did a great job. I had my ostomy at 43 and was already married, so I didn't have to deal with any of those issues that you've gone through. And I've never been to youth camp.
Oh shoot, Steve broke up.
I think we might have lost Steve.
We lost Steve.
Am I back?
Oh, you're back now.
Anyway, what I was saying is that you just put a whole different perspective on for me as to living a life with ostomy. I've had mine now for 27 years. I think that's a long time, but obviously not as long as you have. So it was interesting to hear those issues. And I mean, yes, they've come up over the period of time. I was a support group president for 20 years, and those topics have obviously come up in that kind of thing. So anyway, I thought you did a great job. There are a couple things that I do want to mention in general. The couple questions have come up about whether or not how to access this presentation. And as I said at the beginning, this is being recorded. It will be on the ostomy.org website, ostomy.org/Ostomy Academy. So you can actually see it there. And that's part of the reason why we record these. Jim Morgan asked the question about, or made the comment, well, we could use these as support group meetings. That's why we do these. And that's why they're recorded, is so that they can be used as your presentation. So anyway, those are a couple thoughts that I had. Dan, let's go to the other questions.
We've got some awesome comments here. Serene just said, "This was incredibly awesome. Thank you so much for your, so much, Michael. God bless you." Yeah, lots of great questions and comments. Alyssa, "I'm an ostomy and a cancer survivor. I felt relieved when I saw my stoma because I didn't have to deal with ulcerative colitis symptoms anymore. I'm making my ileostomy permanent. Thank you for doing this video for others." Yeah, and I can relate, Alyssa. I wish I would have had this information when I was first out of my surgery. Julie says, "As a person with stage 4 bladder cancer, I have extreme gratitude that my ostomy change is giving me a chance to live and see my grandchildren grow up." Great perspective, Julie.
And this would be related, just quickly, Amy, I don't mean to interrupt you, but this would be related to what we talked about earlier, and that is a big component of adjustment is, what does it mean to me to have an ostomy? I really loved, or I have really loved UOAA's Lifesaver movement, because, by the way, as I'm sucking on a Lifesaver, because to that end, if I'm thinking about it as a lifesaver, as something that has given me new life, obviously my reactions and responses to it are going to be very different than, this is a burden, this is a curse, something to that effect.
It's that meaning making. We have power in that way, don't we? Awesome. Well, we have some pre-submitted questions. Oh, one more comment. You want to read this one, Steve?
How can one work towards thriving more consistently when the pendulum swinging between these stages? Big question, I realize, but any thoughts you may have. Obviously, that's all. We all go through those ups and downs when we've had good days and bad days, and then also good periods and that kind of thing. So I think it's you're the professional, but that goes back to what you said earlier about there is no right or wrong. It's just a matter of trying to deal with it and learn as you go and making the best of it from my perspective. But you're the professional, so I'll let you answer that one.
Actually, Steve, I don't have much to add. I will say this. I love Jessica Stewart. Jessica was a camper. I've known Jessica for a very long time. Jessica, I hope you are well. It's great to see you here. The one thing I would say is this is a part of where resilience does come into play, because one of the things that I tell people, and I'm actually just building off of what Steve said, adjustment is not linear. We often think of growth over time, and I say we meaning everyone, not just Ostomates, but we often think of growth and progress as being linear. I'm always ascending. I'm always improving. When in reality, over time, just as a normal part of life, forget adjustment to disability or adjustment to ostomy, we often plateau. We might even, if we lose a job or go through a breakup or experience a death of someone close to us, we might even regress. So when I talk to people about how can I thrive or how can you thrive or live, so to speak, more consistently, really a lot of this is continuing on, persisting, understanding that there's likely a history of periods in which I have not been thriving, and yet they have passed. And yet I've been able to get back to a place of thriving. I often will talk to clients about this notion that with respect to chronic illness, disability, or living with a diversion, it's not a matter of, I've overcome it and now it's done. It's more like I've learned to live with it, which will include, as Steve noted, the ups and downs. I hope you're well, Jessica. I miss you.
Here's a pre-submitted question. Are there therapists available virtually who are used to counsel ostomates? So we've got some resources we can put in the chat. I mean, Michael, I don't know how you feel about virtual counseling, but counseling is so important. It's such a great tool to have in your tool belt. So, I mean, I would think that would be an amazing tool to have, right? Virtual counseling.
The good news is the research shows there really isn't that much difference in terms of outcomes between virtual and in person. So if virtual is what you have access to, maybe, the person who specializes in working with persons with chronic illness, disability, ostomy, diversion is in another state or is in the northern part of your state and you live in the southern. Virtual, in my experience, is just as effective, just as helpful as in person. Now, I will say, Amy, some people have personal preferences for one over the other, but that doesn't necessarily equate to effectiveness. Both are good.
Okay, good to know. Thanks for the question. That was from a registrant. Do we have another pre-submitted question to add here? Okay. Steve, you want to take this one?
I've only had my bag for 3 weeks. I need a lot of advice. We've all been there. We've all been there. And actually, this kind of ties into a question that Dr. George has submitted about having issues. There's help out there. It's just a matter of trying to find it. And I know that can be a real challenge at some points in time. Dr. George, I saw that Linda Coulter responded to you, and boy, there's a resource of unbelievable information there. But try to find a medical professional. And if nothing else, the UOAA virtual ostomy clinic is something to be able to help from that standpoint as well, as far as leakage. I've said for years, the way you deal with your ostomy at 1 week, at 1 month, at 1 year, in 10 years, it's an ever evolving process. There is no one single way to it. And so you've got to be able to learn to adapt. But there is help out there. And sometimes it can be a struggle to find it, but there are people out there that are willing to help.
And don't forget about those affiliated support groups we have, over 205 across the country, with peers that have been, going through what you've gone through. Michael spoke to that peer-to-peer model and how powerful that can be. So we have an ASG support group finder that we can link in there. And then also remember this as an experienced person living with an ostomy, how important that is to go back and provide support for people that maybe are 3 weeks out. I mean, that's one of the reasons that I am still really active in my local support group here in Denver, is because I feel like I want to pay that forward. And Liz in Cincinnati, she's the ASG leader there. So yeah, next question, what are strong support groups? We've got lots of those. Please plug in as needed. All right. Any more
Amy Lee, I'd like to address one last comment if I can.
Sure.
Frank Barnhart, he says, this was an extremely helpful and impressive session. Do you think the communities people are starting to accept the ostomy community? And boy, that is something that we at UOAA have been trying to do. That's why we're here. That's kind of one of our mantras, is to try to spread the word that having an ostomy is a lifesaver, and it is a good thing. So I get frustrated to talk to people that don't know what an ostomy is, and I'm like, there all this work that the UOA puts into it, but it is, yes, I do think we're progressing. We've made great strides over the last 20 years. And also, I firmly believe that most ostomates are willing to help another ostomate. So if you're having issues, if you can find another ostomate, it's like WOCN's, wound ostomy continence nurses. I've never found one that isn't willing to help. So most ostomates are willing to try to help any way they can.
You know, I just want to build off of what Steve said. I do want to clarify with respect to involvement. Although I am in a leadership role with the Youth Rally, I'm a member of the board, I'm a resource counselor with the Youth Rally, I provide the mental health support. I was also a camper. And, you know, one thing I would just point out for everyone is, although Amy, Steve, and I are in some degree of leadership type role in serving others with chronic illness, disability, ostomy, diversion, for those who were in attendance, you don't have to do that. You can be a member of a peer group. And the reason I want to share that is not that Steve and Amy weren't alluding to that, but in peer models, you are getting support, and you being present is actually providing support to others. You don't have to be in a leadership role to be able to support others. You can be getting support and still do right by other people. So I'm really appreciative of Steve and Amy and what UOAA has done with respect to ASGs, because just by participating and being there, you are contributing.
Well said. I think we have one more question, one more live question. So this one is, how can I stop having nightmares about losing my colon? I keep dreaming about things missing that are not. And this one also came in as a pre-submitted question too. And I don't know if, this is kind of the trauma, maybe more in lines of that. I know this is pretty specific. Michael, do you want to take a stab at it?
Yeah, I have to confess, nightmares are not necessarily my thing. And to be honest, for the person who asked this, research on like nightmare disorder and how to deal with nightmare disorder, there's really very little to it. I would say Amy probably framed this question exactly right, which is, I would think less, personally, sorry, as a clinician, I would think less about nightmares specifically and more about what's going on internally that's producing these nightmares. Typically, how we understand dreams and nightmares to occur is, although they are never accurate, they're never typically realistic representations of what's going on. They're certainly not predictive of what's going to happen. They are typically manifestations of emotional states. So clearly, if I'm having nightmares about losing things, there's the potential that I'm having some sort of anxious distress around loss, some sort of fear around potentially like physical impairment or body disintegrity, something to that effect. So as Amy noted, finding help and support for those internal experiences potentially has the capacity to reduce distressing dreams.
Yeah, and as always, the 988 number is something that you can call if you're in crisis. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up here. Steve and Michael, if you guys have any last words or anything that you want to add, and then I'll finish this off.
All I want to say is happy Thanksgiving and happy holidays. And I'll see you all in 2025.
Amy, Steve, I just want to thank you again from the bottom of my heart for inviting me and letting me do this. And please don't hesitate to share my contact information for those who attended or any who might be interested. I'm always happy to connect with other Ostomates.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, so just in closing, this is our last installment of Ostomy Academy for 2024, like Steve said, but we are working behind the scenes on getting you a great series of webinars for 2025. Please reach out to us if there's something that you want to see, something you're interested in. We love all your feedback. And if you like learning from our Ostomy Academy broadcasts and you'd be interested in in-person educational sessions, then you need to check out UOAA's National Conference, or as Z termed it tonight, Adult Rally, which will be held in Orlando, Florida. And that will be August 14th through the 16th, 2025. So not only will there be in-person educational sessions, but there'll also be face-to-face connection with people that have ostomies and hands-on access to exhibits of all sorts of different ostomy products and accessories. So the registration for our conference will begin in January. So stay tuned for that. We'll put a link in the chat. And then if you feel that Ostomy Academy, our programs here, and other UOAA programming has benefited you and the ostomy community, we would love to have you donate if you're able and become a national member of our community. We'd love to have you. And lastly, again, I just want to thank Michael for joining us tonight and for sharing so candidly. UOAA staff member Ed Fuller, who is always the behind-the-scene wizard, my friend and Ostomy Academy moderator Liz Hiles. A special thanks to my wonderful friend and co-host Steve, and then a big thank you to all of our viewers. So we will see you next year. Take care, everybody.